Hello everybody and welcome to this tutorial, and right now let's cover the Portscanner conversion to a class. Alright, so anyone who's actually covered and learned Python before knows what classes are and knows why they are important, and in this case, in our case, we want to make sure that we convert it to class for the better usage inside of this vulnerability scanner project. Alright, so first thing that we are going to do is we're going to create the class at the top of this program. We're going to create it with the keyword class, and then we're going to call it, let's say, Portscan. Open and close brackets and add two dots, and this is how we can create a class. Now, all of these functions that we have below, we want to make sure that they belong to our Portscan class. So what we can do is we can tab each and every line. So let's do it one by one, like this, and you will see that some of these actual keywords will start changing colors as they start belonging to our Portscan class. Alright, so let's do it like this. All of it should be tabbed once, so let's go like this, and the scan port at the end. Okay, so here it is. Now, this part of the program, you might be asking what we're going to do with this. Well, in this case, we don't need it, so we can simply just delete that. All we need are our class with these functions right here. Let me just create space between each of these functions so we can see each and every one of them a little bit better. And now let's see what we need to do in order to get this to work. Well, first of all, we are missing a function that every class needs, and that is the init function. This init function will be coded at the top of the class, so right below the initiation of the class itself, we're going to type def __ init __. Alright, and you will notice that by default, if I open and close brackets, it will add this self argument as a parameter to this init function or init method right here. And this self argument basically means that it is belonging to this class, and what we're going to define inside of this init method is all of the stuff, well, all of the parameters that are going to define the object to our class. For example, we want to define the target parameter and the port number parameter. That is an actual attribute to our class which defines our object. Alright? So next to this self argument, we need to define those two attributes. So the first one we can call target, and the second one, which is the new one, will be called port _ number. Alright, so simple as that. And in order to define them inside of the init function, we simply just type self.target will be equal to target, and self.port number will be equal to port number. And this is just a Python way to actually define them, so nothing really important there. Let me just delete this empty space. And now that we have our init function, we need to add this self argument or self parameter to each and every function that belongs to this class. So we're simply just going to go right here and type self. We're also going to type self right here. Self right here, and self right here. And another very important thing that we should consider is that we don't need any of these other parameters outside of the self parameter. And why is that? Well, once you define those attributes that we need inside of this init method right here, we can access these variables throughout each and every function in our class. So we don't need to paste them as parameters. Let us just delete everything but the self parameter from each and every class. And right here as well. Make sure you do not delete it from the init method. So let's leave it like this. So now that we fixed all of the methods, let's restructure our program a little bit. So I will start off with this scan port function. Alright, so what we're going to do with this scan port function, besides it doing the usual stuff that it did inside of our Portscanner project, we're going to add the converted IP into the scan port function instead of the scan function. So we're going to delete it from the scan function first. Let's go right here. We also are not interested into printing anymore, since printing we're going to do in the main program, which is going to be the vulnerability scanner. So our scan function will be left with just these 2 lines of code, while the conversion of the IP address will be moved right here into the scan port function. So we're going to call the check IP function. And you will notice right away that some of the stuff inside of our class is actually red underlined. And by some of the stuff I mean a lot of things, such as for example this check IP is underlined, these 2 variables are underlined, this get banner is underlined, the port is underlined. So all of this stuff are underlined, which means that they are not recognized by the PyCharm. Well, why is that? Let's start off first with the functions themselves as to why they are underlined. Once you create a class, you need to actually rename those functions when you call them inside of the class. You need to add the self argument before. So for example, if I type self.checkIP, you will notice that it will no longer be a red underlined, and this will get recognized by the PyCharm. This is just a way to call different methods from the class itself, so the class can recognize that this check IP belongs to its own methods, and therefore it knows which actual method to call. Same goes with this getBanner function right here, which we can simply just add self.getBanner, and it will stop being red underline. Let's see whether we have another function which is red underline. Here it is, scanPort. If I simply just type self.scanPort, we can see it works successfully. Now, but what are we going to do with these actual variables, which are red underlined? Well, first of all, we don't really need this IP address variable anymore, as we're actually getting the IP address from our main part of the program, which is going to be the target's IP variable right here. And then we're going to paste it into our class, which will then get stored inside of this self.target variable, which then we can use throughout our class. So let's change it everywhere we can. First of all, we're going to change it in the check IP method. So we're no longer checking the IP from the IP, we're checking the IPs from the self.target, and make sure that throughout of this class you also use the self argument when specifying the variable name. So we're trying the IP function from self.target, and in case it works, we're returning self.target. In case it doesn't work, we want to return the getHostByName from the self.target. Once again, keep in mind that this will store the IP address from our target machine. Same goes right here to the scan port. We don't really need this converted IP anymore. And why don't we need it? Well, we don't need it because, as you can see, the scan port function doesn't take the IP address as a parameter anymore. Therefore, this is red underlined, so we can simply delete it. But what with this port number? Well, we actually need to send this port as a parameter because we are inside of this for loop, therefore this port will change through each iteration. And we need to specify to this method right here which iteration is it currently at. So we need to send the port as an argument. Therefore we're going to go to the scan port, and next to the self we're going to add port as a parameter, and you will see right here at these 3 spots the red underline will go away, as this port now exists in this program. And the last part, which is red underlined, is this IP address right here. Once again, we don't really need this IP address anymore. We have self.target, and right here, since at the beginning of this try statement we converted the IP, we don't need to specify self.target right here. We can specify converted IP. Alright, since this will be the IP address, whether the target was specified as a domain or simply as an IP address. Alright? Another thing that we want to make sure is that we don't have unnecessary functions that can be put inside of a different functions. For example, this getBanner can also be put inside of this scanPort function. Therefore, we don't really need this method right here. So we can simply just delete the getBanner, and we can put it right here. As you will see, this will get flagged as getBanner doesn't exist anymore. Therefore, instead of trying to call this function, what we're going to do is we're going to write the get banner function code instead right here. So sock.receive. We want to receive 1024 bytes. And we're simply just using the sock object that we created right here. So no worries about that. We don't need to name it anything differently. We also want to decode the response. And the reason why we're decoding the response is so we don't really have to do it later on right here. So once we decode the response, we then want to strip it from any unnecessary characters, such as for example \n, and also we want to strip it from \r. And the reason why we are performing this stripping part is because, especially in this program right here in our vulnerability scanner, it is important to strip everything that we don't need from the response, as this banner variable will store the most important and crucial part to our vulnerability scanner. As inside of this program, we're going to compare this banner variable with the actual content from this vulnerability file in order if they match. So for example, if we have the same banner in a vulnerability file and the same banner gets retrieved into this variable, and imagine that we do not strip these actual characters from it, well, our program will not really find a match, as they will be different only by this character. So that's why we're stripping it, as the new line character is not important to us. Alright? So simple as that. The next thing we actually don't need is these print statements right here. We needed them inside of our Portscanner project, but we don't need them anymore, as we are not really interested in printing which ports are closed and which ports are open, since this is not a port scanner. But however, there is another problem that will occur, and that is that this banner can only store one banner at a time. But we need to retrieve multiple banners if we find multiple ports open on the targets, and if we also manage to retrieve multiple banners from those open ports. So we will need to store multiple banners and not just one. So how can we fix that? Well, we can actually easily fix that. We can simply just add a list, which will be at the beginning of our class. Right here we're going to call it banners, and in order to define a list we specify these square brackets right here. By specifying open and close square brackets, we initiate that this banners list will be empty for now, and then every time we actually manage to retrieve the banner right here with this line, we can then right after it below append the actual banner to the banners list, just like this. And you will notice that this banners is red underlined. That means that we need to add the self.banners argument right here, and everything will work correctly. And in case we don't manage to retrieve the banner, we're simply just going to pass for now. Alright? And at the end, we can simply just close the connection with sock.close. So simple as that. Let me see if everything is correct for now. Everything seems to be good. Our get check IP function is good. Our scan is good. But don't worry. There is another thing that we actually have to do, which is going to be to create another list, which is going to be the open ports list. Now you might be asking, why are we actually doing this? And this is more easily showed than explained, but I will try to explain it anyway right now, and once we run the program you will get it why we need this open ports list. For now on, let me just try to explain it. Well, once we actually created this class right here with these three methods, you notice that we also had to create this banners list right here in order to store multiple banners. Once we actually get to actually printing those banners and open ports into our vulnerability scanner, we want to make sure that each open port will match to each banner. And since we removed all of the print statements, we cannot really print open port one by one. We have to store all of the open ports somewhere and all of the banners somewhere, and then we have to print them, each element one by one. That's why we also need the open port list that we created right here, and after each time we manage to connect to a port, we will add that port to the open ports list. So self.openPorts and then .append, the same way we are adding the banners, we're also going to add open ports, and we're simply just going to specify right here port. Alright? Now, that is not the end of our problems. You noticed once we actually had Portscanner project that we had more open ports than more banners retrieved. For example, some of the ports that were open and that we tagged as open weren't sending us any banner, therefore we just didn't have banner for that open port. And that can present us a problem because if we have 10 open ports, for example, and we retrieve only 3 banners, then in one list, which will be the open ports list, we will have 10 elements or 10 ports, and in the banners list, we will have 3 elements. And therefore, once we want to print each element one by one, for example, the element 1 from the open ports should correspond to the element 1 from banners, and so on, it will get confused in some of the open ports which don't have banners will get banners, and it will all get mixed up and it will not be correct. Therefore, we want to make sure that the open port list has the exact same amount of elements as the banners list has. So each element can respond to each element from the different list. How can we do that, since we are obviously going to have less banners than open ports? Well, we can fix that just by, instead of the pass statement right here under the except, we can also append to the banners list. So for each open port, we're going to append anyway. Even if it manages to retrieve the banner, we are going to append. And if it doesn't manage to retrieve the banner, we're also going to append. So self.banners.append, but in this case, we are simply just going to append empty space. We're not going to append any string or anything else. It will simply just be there, so an element can get added to the banners list. Alright? So we simply change this so we can have the same amount of elements in both banners and open ports. And with this, we successfully transformed our port scanner into an actual class that we can use inside of our vulnerability scanner project. And in the next video, we're going to see how we can call this class from our vulnerability scanner. Okay, so thank you for watching this tutorial, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.